Though I hate to admit it, back in middle school I found myself in the friend zone. There was this girl named Nicole who was rather pretty, but she also wasn't the nicest person. At some point I developed a crush on her. Why exactly? I don't know. I knew next to nothing about her. One day in social studies we got paired up on this project, and I couldn't have been happier. Little did I know the nightmare that would eventually unfold. On the day we got put together, which was incidentally the first time I had an actual conversation with her, she seemed pretty disinterested about the project. We had to make this poster about a historical figure from the Gilded Era, and though I wasn't any kind of history buff, I told Nicole I wouldn't mind doing most of the work. When I said that, Nicole looked at me and smiled, and I nearly fell over. I eagerly asked her when and where she wanted to work on stuff, and she said she just remembered that her and her parents were getting ready for a trip soon, and so she wouldn't actually be able to work on it after school. Then she smiled again and asked if I wouldn't mind starting to work on it myself, and that she'd really appreciate it. I still get upset when I think back to how readily I agreed, but of course that's what 14-year-old me did. I even started doing research for it that afternoon when I got home, which is something I absolutely would not have done under any other circumstances. The project was due in like 2 weeks, but our social studies teacher, Mrs. Erickson, would occasionally give us time to work in class, which of course put me on cloud 9. When we did have these times, which were usually just the last 10 or 15 minutes of class, I tried to bring Nicole up to speed on what I'd done so far, and eventually I started bringing the poster in. At first Nicole thanked me for working on it, and said she'd try to do some of it herself, but the next time she always had an excuse, and eventually it seemed she stopped caring altogether. Now things might have just ended with her using me for this project, but on the Friday a few days before it was due, Nicole asked me if I'd be willing to help her with something at her house. Of course I was beside myself and readily agreed. I asked if this had something to do with her trip, and she looked confused for a moment. Apparently she'd forgotten about that alibi, even though I still believed it. 2 seconds later, she said that the trip had got put on hold, but that she needed my help with something else. She said that she'd only be comfortable asking a quote, real friend to help her, and my heart started to fly. I could barely contain my excitement the rest of the day, and when I got home from school, I immediately told my mom I was going to work on the project with Nicole. I don't know if my mom knew I had a crush on Nicole, but I'm pretty sure she at least suspected it. I brought this collection of relatively elaborate flower stickers I got from somewhere as a gift for Nicole, and then started riding my bike. I hadn't actually gone over to her house before, but she told me her address and it was only like 15 minutes away. I'd never been to that neighborhood either, and it was pretty upscale. That made me nervous for some reason. Eventually I got to her house, which had 2 stories like most of the others nearby. There was a car and an SUV in the driveway, and I assumed they belonged to Nicole's mom and sister, which she had told me she had. I got off and walked my bike up to their porch and rang the bell, the whole time with butterflies in my stomach. I waited for like 30 seconds, but no one answered the door. I didn't even hear anything. Therefore I knocked, softly at first and then louder. Eventually I did hear footsteps, but they didn't sound like Nicole's. Then the door cracked open, and I saw some dude in his early 20s. The guy was wearing a red sweater and baggy jeans and had several large tattoos on his arm. He didn't say anything at first, but instead just looked at me. Finally I managed to blurt out, "I'm here for Nicole," and the man smirked. He turned his head back into the house and said, "Sweetie, that guy's here." I somehow knew automatically that he and Nicole were romantically involved, and I can't convey in words the dejection I felt in that moment. I heard Nicole say something from further inside the house, and the man looked back at me and smiled. Even though sadness was the main emotion I was feeling, I started to get creeped out almost immediately. For one thing, the man was probably at least 6 years older than me and Nicole, but for another, there was something disturbing about his expression. I willed myself to walk inside, maybe half believing that I could still have some kind of chance with Nicole, even though the best decision would have been to turn around and leave. Nicole's house was nicely decorated, but a second after I walked in, I got hit with an odor. It was weed, though I didn't know it at the time. I took a few steps into the foyer area and stopped because I literally didn't know what to do. The other guy was just standing a few feet away from me, looking at me. I tried to avoid eye contact, hoping he or Nicole would tell me what they needed help with. After what seemed like 10 minutes, I finally heard Nicole's voice come from down the hallway. "Jeff, come over here." Jeff isn't my real name, but I'll use it for the story. I began walking, all the while trying to watch that man out of my peripheral vision. strangely, he didn't follow me, and that made me glad. I came out of the hallway into their family room and immediately noticed that something was off. Well, I guess I got that feeling before, but what I saw in the room was rather confusing to me in that moment. There were 3 couches covered in white tarps, and on them were a bunch of electronics, including like 10 Xboxes. There were video games as well, along with DVD players, sound systems, and what I think were routers. The smell was also stronger in this room, and with each passing second, I regretted coming in more and more. Nicole was sitting on the floor next to one of the tarps, doing something on her phone. She didn't seem to acknowledge my presence when I walked in, waiting about 10 seconds to put the phone down and look up at me. Her expression was not at all nice. There was something else in it I couldn't put my finger on. When she looked up, I said hey, and she feigned a smile and told me, "Thanks for coming over." I was just about to ask her what she needed help with when she asked if I could help them take the stuff out to a warehouse. Not only was there a lot of stuff, some of which looked heavy, but by this time alarm bells started going off in my head. Maybe it was the adrenaline in my veins, but I managed to look Nicole in the eye and ask her who that other person was. She looked at the hallway, then back at me, and said that was her cousin. Instinctively I turned around, and sure enough he was standing at the entrance to the room. Now I was like 99% sure this guy wasn't Nicole's cousin, and they were both doing something illegal, but I felt like playing dumb was my best option. With as much charisma as I could, I looked at the guy and said, "Nice to meet you." He looked at me with that same smirk, and I felt my body tense up. I looked back at Nicole, and trying to sound excited, I asked, "Where are we taking this?" Nicole then told me to help her put the stuff in the SUV, to which the man muttered something I didn't quite hear. She looked worried for a moment, and told me to wait there as she walked over and talked to the guy. After exchanging a few words, the guy walked out of view, and Nicole told me that her cousin would pull the SUV into the garage to make it easier to load. So that's what we did. I didn't know if there was some special way we should pack the stuff, since some of it was rather expensive, but I didn't want to ask questions. Instead, I just picked up 2 DVD players and followed Nicole. Apparently there was no special way, and we were just throwing it into the back of the SUV. Naturally, this raised a lot of questions, including, where did all this stuff come from, and why did they need me? Of course I didn't ask them, and though I considered doing it, I didn't make small talk either. I just kept loading more stuff and praying to God that I could leave after we were done. Between the 3 of us, it didn't take long at all, and I was literally about to tell Nicole it was nice to meet her cousin when I noticed them exchange some kind of glance. My heart literally dropped into my stomach when Nicole told me they needed some help unpacking the stuff at the warehouse. Those words cut like a knife, but it was what happened next that truly horrified me. We were standing a few feet away from each other in Nicole's garage, and the guy walked over to where I was standing and aggressively put his arm on my shoulder. "Come on, we just need you to help us drop this off." My mind was rapidly moving back and forth between making a break for it and going along, but I knew I probably couldn't get away from that guy. Again, trying my best to be convincing, I blurted out, "Sure." The guy opened the door behind the driver's side and motioned for me to get in, which I did. Then he got in front of me and Nicole took shotgun. I put my seatbelt on and the guy started pulling out of their driveway. I looked at the back of his head and then over at Nicole, but they were both facing forwards. I still didn't know exactly what the situation was, but I was growing more terrified by the minute. Looking at the door, I noticed that it wasn't locked. That made me begin strongly considering jumping out at a red light, but I knew I wanted to wait until I got to a more populated area. I didn't see any cars driving around nearby in Nicole's neighborhood, so I didn't want to make my escape there. Periodically, I looked back at the man and Nicole, and then I noticed it. A shiny piece of metal sticking out of the man's pocket. My heart was pounding in my chest, and each passing second felt like an hour. Eventually the man turned out of Nicole's neighborhood and back onto one of the main roads. Thank God it was rush hour. We started slowing down behind a bunch of other cars at a red light, and almost without thinking, I undid my seatbelt and swung the door open. The guy and Nicole snapped their heads in my direction, and maybe they said something, but it was really all a blur. I ran between the stopped cars in the next lane over, and after checking for oncoming traffic, ran to the other side of the road. There was a shopping center with a big store nearby, and I didn't stop running until I made it inside. I didn't have a cell phone, so I asked one of the cashiers out of breath if I could use their phone. She knew immediately that something was wrong and didn't hesitate to let me use it. I called my mom, and when she arrived 10 minutes later, she was in tears. She immediately called the police, who actually met us at the store. It was this whole big scene, and I know I would have been way more embarrassed if I wasn't already in shock. When we drove home, it was like 7 o'clock, and my dad was more emotional than I'd ever seen him. I don't know what had already happened at this point, like if he had called Nicole's parents, but I think he was mostly just glad I was okay. To be clear, I don't think my parents blamed me at all for what happened. I mean, as far as we all knew, I was just helping Nicole with schoolwork or something. I can't share a lot of the details, such as what happened at the trial, but as you might have guessed by now, all the things that were loaded up in that SUV were stolen. Incidentally, that guy was Nicole's boyfriend, or at least he was using her affections to his advantage. In addition to him having an inappropriate relationship, he also had to be one of the dumbest criminals there ever were. He ended up going to jail, which was a weight off my shoulders. As far as why they needed me to tag along in the first place, apparently they were dropping off the stolen merchandise with someone who had beef with the guy from before, and they wanted me to be the cover so that the guy wouldn't be recognized. I'm just glad their plan never made it that far, because who knows what could have happened in that situation. But backing up to before the trial, one thing I was dreading was having to confront Nicole at school, since of course we were in the same class and were partners on that project. But luckily, Nicole never came back. I did see her a few times when I gave testimony at court, but outside of that I never saw her again. Of course people at school found out about what happened and pressured me for details, but I never really opened up to anyone about it. At one point I heard the rumor that I had actually fought the guy off with his own knife, and maybe it was for that reason that people didn't want to mess with me and gave me some space. In any case, I made it through the rest of junior high and high school without any real problems. I was just glad to be able to put that behind me. The experience did teach me a valuable lesson though. Don't let people take advantage of you, because they could turn out to be the worst kind of people. Back when I started college is when I signed up for dating apps like OkCupid and Plenty of Fish. I'd had 2 longer-term girlfriends up to that point, and overall I'd say my experiences in high school were pretty typical. I mostly just signed up to see what it was like, because a lot of the other guys in my dorm were already using them. I definitely wasn't looking for another long-term relationship, at least not right away, and this one experience I had after only a few weeks almost made me delete all of the apps then and there. After getting used to matching and messaging and honestly improving my conversation skills a bit, I'd managed to score several dates. I know that's definitely not everyone's experience, and me being in a larger college town at the start of the school year surely had a lot to do with it. Though I kind of vibed with one girl I'd met up with, she wasn't interested after that, so far I hadn't been on any second dates. Still, I was in no hurry, and as my classwork was starting to pick up, I was considering taking a break anyway. Eventually I matched with this girl who I'll call Riley, who apparently had just started her freshman year at a nearby community college. From her bio, she had grown up in the area and had moved into her own apartment not too long ago and was looking to meet new people. She was rather attractive, and I was definitely interested in going on a date with her. I messaged her something generic like, "Hey cutie," and I felt a surge of excitement when I heard the notification sound that she had replied. I managed to strike up a decent conversation, and I tried to tie it into the things she had listed on her profile. I don't want to go into specifics out of privacy reasons, but suffice it to say the conversation was going well. We chatted a bit over the next several nights, and I didn't notice any red flags at any point in the conversation. Eventually we set up a date for that Friday night at one of the local bars, and right before 8 I parked my Chevy Camaro in a lot behind the restaurant and walked around to the front. The place wasn't that big, though it was decently busy, and after a moment of looking around I couldn't find Riley. Therefore I walked to the hostess and asked for a table for 2. A minute later she sat me at one of the tables by the front windows, which was good so I could watch out for Riley. But this is where things took a turn for the unexpected. While glancing out the window, some random dude I'd never seen before walked right up to my table. At first I thought he was a waiter, or someone else asking if they could borrow a chair, but immediately something felt off. The guy was dressed in a long-sleeved t-shirt and cargo shorts and had a bit of a beard. I waited for him to say something, but after like 10 seconds of him just staring me down, I finally asked if I could help him with something. "Are you waiting for Riley?" he said. The words caught me off guard, and the realization that I might have gotten catfished hit me hard. I tried to think of what to say, and eventually asked him, "Do you know her?" To that, the man didn't say anything, but I noticed he was frowning. and there was just something about the way he looked at me that creeped me right out. Just then I noticed someone walk up and open the door. It was Riley. The guy standing at my table must have noticed her too, because he immediately turned and walked away. A moment later, Riley came to where I was sitting and put out her arms for a hug. I was very confused, but got up anyway and hugged her back. As we sat down, she asked how I was doing. I couldn't tell if she knew the other guy, or knew he was here. I gave like 2 or 3 other generic replies before asking if she knew someone here. Riley told me no, and when she saw I was still unsure, she seemed to get curious. She asked me who I thought she knew, so I came out and told her about the guy that had walked up to my table the moment before she got here. Riley didn't immediately say anything, so I described his appearance and told her he seemed to run away when she came into view. I was trying my best to read Riley, but I honestly couldn't tell if she was involved with him or not. Eventually I could see she was starting to get weirded out, so on the off chance she had no idea who this guy was, I let it drop for a while. Unfortunately, that had already made things pretty awkward, but somehow I managed to get them back on track. All the while I was scanning our surroundings for that guy, but either he was somewhere I couldn't see or he had left through another entrance. The place did have a back inside entrance, so I didn't think that was unlikely. It also occurred to me that maybe it was one of the other guys in my dorm messing with me, but honestly that didn't seem like it'd be the case. I shared a dorm room with 3 other guys, but they hadn't pulled any pranks like this so far, and I don't think I mentioned the exact place or time I was meeting Riley, just that I had a date on Friday night. Eventually I had to go to the bathroom, and while I hadn't brought that guy up in conversation again, I was still scanning my surroundings as I walked to the back of the bar. It was a little after 9 now, and still pretty busy. I went inside, did what I had to do, and came back out into the hallway a minute later, and that's when I saw him. Through one of the windows on the side, I saw the guy standing about 20 feet away on the sidewalk. He noticed me notice him almost immediately and walked quickly out of view towards the back of the restaurant. That honestly freaked me out a bit, since it meant he had been waiting somewhere for over an hour, and I doubted even more that this was some kind of innocent prank. My heart started racing as I walked back to our table in the front, and though Riley was smiling when I got there, she quickly realized something was wrong. I told her in a quiet voice that I saw that same man standing outside on the sidewalk. I could see how upset that made her, and could sense that she thought I might have something to do with this. I tried my best to convince her that I had no idea who that man was, and that I would never do something like this on a date. Riley did seem to believe me, and after a minute or so, she said in a low voice that we should go. Riley had walked several blocks from her apartment, so I offered to either give her a ride or to wait with her while I called her an Uber or she called one of her friends. I looked around again, and then walked over to the bar and told them we had to leave immediately and paid the bill. Then Riley walked up next to me and whispered in my ear, "Is that him?" I turned to see her looking back at our table, and the man standing on the other side of the window. I nodded, and heart racing, I figured I needed to confront whoever that was. This time the man didn't leave, and I walked out the front entrance and stopped about 6 feet from where he was standing. I asked him what he wanted. However, he didn't say anything, so after what was like 10 seconds, I asked him to please leave us alone. All the while, I was studying the man's face, which was that same slight frown from earlier. Eventually, he spoke in a soft voice and told me that he wanted to be the one to date Riley. Those words sent a chill up my spine, and now I knew this guy was deranged. I was thinking about ways to de-escalate the situation when the man spoke again, this time telling me how he considered Riley to be a good friend, and that she could have loved him if he had had the confidence to speak with her. I told the man that I was sorry and that I didn't know, and offered to sit down and talk with him. While I wasn't looking back through the windows, I had no doubt Riley was watching us, and I was trying to make hand gestures behind my back. I expected the man to say something else to that, but instead he just shook his head and turned around and walked away. I stood there for like 30 seconds, watching him until he had faded from view into the crowd on the sidewalk. Then I walked back inside, where Riley was waiting by the doors on the verge of tears. I decided not to tell her what the guy said just yet, so instead I asked Riley if she wanted to get in my car because I thought the guy had left. Riley nodded and we walked quickly out the back entrance and got in. I turned the car on and pulled out of the lot back onto the main road. We didn't see anything suspicious on the way to Riley's apartment, and she let me walk her inside. I expected her to still be suspicious of me and want to lock herself inside her apartment the moment she got there, but she actually asked me to come in and wait with her a bit. I accepted her offer, and we came inside. After turning on the lights and setting her things down, Riley looked at me and let out a nervous laugh. I, having no idea what to do in a situation like this, laughed too. I'm glad I had apparently earned Riley's trust while going out to confront the man. When I told Riley what he had said, she started freaking out, but I put my arm around her and was able to comfort her. For the next 2 hours, we tried our best to figure out unequivocally who that guy was, but even though Riley managed to get a good look at his face, we still weren't sure. But even more importantly, we weren't sure how that man knew Riley and I were going on a date, and when and where we'd meet. What made the situation even more intense was the fear that we'd hear her doorbell or a knock on her door, but thankfully that didn't happen. She did ask me to spend the night, which I accepted, and then left in the morning. Though it might sound strange, Riley and I bonded over this experience, and we're actually still together today. After this incident took place, Riley contacted her friends and family, and I checked in with my dorm mates. They all seemed to be as shocked as I was, and I still highly doubted that any of them had anything to do with this. I also didn't think my accounts had been compromised, but still changed the passwords regardless. Eventually, one of Riley's friends suggested a theory that we still considered to be the most likely one. Riley plays a musical instrument and attended the same summer band camp each year between 5th grade and her sophomore year of high school. Part of the activities include people practicing with the other people who play their same instrument, and Riley vaguely remembered hanging out with this one kid who played her same instrument but went to a different school. She remembers him being at the camp most, if not all, of the years she was there, but she's not sure. Riley said his appearance was different, but with several years having passed since the last time she saw him, he could indeed be that same person. She describes the one at band camp as being shy and quiet, but otherwise normal. Based on having literally no other leads, we consider that to be the most likely scenario, though to be clear, Riley is a good person and would never willingly lead someone on or put them in the friend zone like that. I think it just goes to show that some people aren't all there and can get infatuated after even one or a few casual interactions. Now, I don't hate that man, and who knows what his home life was like or what he had to deal with. I just hope that he was able to move on and lead a happy life. But one thing still really bothers me. The only plausible way that man knew about our date was if he had access to Riley's account on the dating websites, and while it's likely he could have found her on the site, Riley swears that she had a strong password and didn't share it with anyone. She also denies ever losing her phone or lending it to any of her friends. Riley and I actually filed a police report and they conducted a formal investigation. To the best of our knowledge, her account was never hacked or her messages read, including by people working at the company. Therefore, how the man was able to track us down was and still is a complete mystery, and I just pray that he never shows up again one day. I'm sure a lot of us have weird high school experiences, and probably ones that are downright bizarre. But I doubt a lot of people have one stretching on for this long and being this creepy. For backstory, my high school had this club called Young Adult Interpersonal Development Team. I guess it was kind of like National Honor Society, but I'm pretty sure it was just started by one of the teachers at our school and didn't exist anywhere else. It was also open to join for all students. We'd routinely volunteer in the community, such as by helping clean up a park or by visiting a nursing home. But we also went to one or two conference-type things that were geared more towards business and professional networking. My friend Arjun, or as we called him RJ, randomly found out about it through word of mouth our freshman year, and we decided to join so we could put it on our resume. Honestly though, it was super chill, and even if we couldn't have put it on for some reason, we still would have done it all 4 years. This was a very small club, and our sophomore year there were only like 8 of us. There were me and RJ, 2 junior girls named Emily and Lauren that were very academically ambitious, and a senior named Mike who was kind of a class clown, as well as our leader that year. There were several freshmen who showed up at various points, and most of them left. One of the ones who stuck around was a girl named Lakshmi, or Locke as we called her. Several different teachers had hosted the club in prior years, and this year it was being run by our social studies teacher, Mrs. O'Malley. She was this super sweet older lady, but was still sharp as a tack. The club ran year-round, though it had more events in the spring. One of the main events was this Young Adult Business Professional Conference that was held in Milwaukee each year in April. It was pretty big, drawing various professionally oriented high school clubs from across Wisconsin and even Illinois. It was a 3-hour drive from our high school, and we'd usually leave Thursday morning and arrive back Sunday night. The conference was held in a different conference center each year, near the outskirts of town, and we'd either stay in the attached hotel, if there was one, or in another hotel nearby. Whoever was running the club would usually get 2 hotel rooms, one for the boys and one for the girls, and we'd sell candy out of these briefcase-shaped box things to raise funds beforehand. One day in February, soon after we got our candy boxes and started fundraising, our club met in Mrs. O'Malley's class right after school. We were just talking and waiting to see if anyone else showed up before working with Mrs. O to plan our next activity and go over more information related to fundraising. I remember RJ and I were laughing about something when he stopped and looked at me. I turned to see this kid standing in the doorway. At first he didn't say anything, and I think we all figured he was just lost. But he kept standing there. 5 seconds later, Mrs. O saw him and asked if he needed anything. The kid mumbled something too low for any of us to hear, so Mrs. O got up from behind her desk and walked over. She stopped about 6 feet away from him, and he mumbled something again. Eventually Mrs. O got closer and turned so that her ear was facing his mouth. Finally he asked in a loud enough voice, "Is this the club?" Mrs. O very sweetly replied, "Do you mean the Young Adult Interpersonal Club?" After like 10 seconds the kid nodded, to which Mrs. O welcomed him very enthusiastically. She motioned towards us, and we said hello and welcomed him as well. The kid didn't actually say his name, and perhaps because Mrs. O thought he was nervous, she didn't ask him. While his first impression was definitely off-putting, I figured he was just really nervous as well. Now, I don't want to comment on his appearance too much, but I will mention he was overweight, to the point I thought he might have some kind of condition. RJ motioned for him to sit next to us, but surprisingly he went over and sat by Locke, who was the only other person here at the moment. To paint more of a picture, Mrs. O'Malley's class had individual desks, and Locke had a textbook and notebook completely filling up her desk as she worked on homework. She was also sitting closer to the wall on the opposite side of the room from the door. Despite there being many unoccupied desks, the kid sat down in one directly adjacent to hers. Locke immediately smiled and said hello, and the kid started talking back to her, but his responses were so quiet we couldn't hear. Eventually another person walked in, I think it was Lauren, and Mrs. O decided to get started. She welcomed us again and told us she hoped we were having a good week so far. We all nodded and said things in agreement, and then Mrs. O looked mostly to Lauren and said that we have a new person joining us. She motioned to where the kid was sitting next to Locke, but apparently he didn't even acknowledge what Mrs. O just said. Instead, Lakshmi was just looking at Mrs. O and smiling nervously. The kid either didn't realize that she was speaking or didn't care, and we all just stood there waiting for him to stop talking. It got awkward pretty fast. Eventually Mrs. O said, "Excuse me, and your name is..." Finally he stopped and looked over at her, and nonchalantly said his name was Jason. "Well, welcome Jason," Mrs. O said, and the rest of us made noises of agreement. After that, we started discussing options for our next service event, and eventually decided on volunteering at this place that helped people donate shoes and clothes. Then Mrs. O checked in with us about our fundraising, and RJ mentioned that he'd already sold like half his box. RJ was a good salesperson, I have to agree. I kept intermittently hearing Jason try talking to Locke, and looked over in their direction. I'm pretty sure he started inching his desk towards hers. And after 20 minutes or so, the activity buses were about to leave, so Mrs. O wrapped up our discussion. She, Jason, and Lauren walked out into the hall, but RJ and I couldn't help but notice Locke kept sitting at her desk. We walked over, and were immediately taken aback at the fact that she was apparently upset. That in and of itself was unusual, given Lakshmi's usually happy-go-lucky demeanor. I asked her what was wrong, and after looking at the door, she said quietly that Jason really creeped her out. RJ and I were automatically on her side, and he asked her what exactly he said, but Locke didn't want to say. A few seconds later, Locke quickly put her book in her backpack and stood up and walked to the door. I looked at RJ, trying to decide if we should go after her and try to talk to her more. Neither of us really knew what to do. Locke wasn't on either of our buses, and we didn't have any classes with her or know her outside of school. Ultimately, we decided to check in with her the next time we saw her, and if we saw Jason was harassing her, to step in immediately. The next time we met as a club was a Saturday after next, when we volunteered at the shoe and clothes donation place. As usual, we had coordinated who was driving beforehand, since not all of us had cars. For this particular event, Mike was picking me and RJ up while the girls were going over together. Usually RJ would walk to my house first, but this time Mike pulled up and RJ was already inside. Apparently Mike had seen him walking over. When I got in the back seat, Mike immediately asked me to spill the beans about this new kid. It sounded like he was joking, but there was also something intense about the way he asked. I honestly had no idea about Jason. I hadn't even seen him before or after our last meeting. Come to think of it, I didn't know what year he was. RJ had basically already told Mike this, along with filling him in on how creepy he had acted with Lakshmi. I won't rehash our entire conversation, but the three of us did agree to help protect her, and started joking about if Jason would show up to the clothing donation place. After following Apple Maps for 15 minutes, Mike pulled up to this strip mall type area. I think most of the shops were closed down, and there were only 3 other cars parked nearby, including Lauren's car and Mrs. O'Malley's car. We got out and walked inside, where there were shelves and racks of old clothing, and some of those long rectangular plastic tables with shoes on top. It kind of gave off Goodwill vibes, but it wasn't a Goodwill. Mrs. O greeted us and introduced us to one of the workers there, a middle-aged woman who sounded like she was a heavy smoker. Our only task was apparently taking the clothes out of these big bins and sorting them by size and type. Apparently the woman had just gotten back from a nearby laundromat where she'd washed and dried them. Lauren, Emily, and Locke were already working on 2 of the bins nearby, so Mike, RJ, and I started removing clothes from 2 bins on the adjacent table. Mike started joking with Lauren and Emily about something, and RJ and I noticed that Locke was being a bit quiet. RJ asked how she was doing, and she smiled and said fine. Neither of us wanted to bring up the topic of what Jason said again, so we didn't. We figured she was just anxious that Jason would show up, and reassured her that we'd stop him from being a creep. Lakshmi just smiled, and we all went back to folding clothes. 30 minutes passed, and we were almost done. I think Mrs. O thought this would take longer, but Mike had turned things into a race, and besides folding the current batch of clothes, there wasn't anything else to do. It was a little after 11 a.m., so we were debating about driving to one of the restaurants nearby afterwards. Just then, we heard someone walk through the door. It was Jason. We turned around and RJ said hey, and Jason said hey back to us. Mike assumed correctly that this was Jason and enthusiastically went over and introduced himself. He half-jokingly told Jason he was a bit late and we were almost done, but Jason didn't really seem to acknowledge that. Instead, he asked if Lakshmi was here. For context, there were several shelves and racks in the middle of the room, and the tables we were working at were slightly out of view of the front door. RJ and I looked at each other, not knowing how we should handle that. Mike didn't immediately answer Jason, and instead asked him to come to one of the other tables with him. They walked to the opposite side of the room, and we weren't sure what Mike was planning to do. So RJ and I walked back to our table, where we saw the 3 girls standing still and quiet. Emily mouthed, "Is that him?" As she hadn't been at our last meeting, she hadn't met Jason either. I nodded, and Lakshmi looked like she was starting to freak out. I'm not sure where Mrs. O was at this moment. Maybe she was in the bathroom, and the woman who worked there was doing something else in the back. A second later, we heard the door open, and then saw Jason walking across the parking lot. I was immediately confused. Then Mike came over and asked to speak to Lauren and Emily. As they told us later, Mike had actually confronted Jason about what he had been saying to Lakshmi and asked him what he had said. Then Jason told Mike it was none of his business, and instead turned around and walked out. Mrs. O returned right after this happened, and at first she thought we were joking with her when we told her Jason had come and then went away. However, Mike pulled Mrs. O aside and explained that it wasn't a joke, and then they pulled Lakshmi aside. Just like at our meeting before, things were now super awkward. The rest of us finished up sorting and folding the clothes, and eventually Mrs. O, Mike, and Lakshmi came back. Mrs. O looked fairly worried and told us that if Jason ever came back to one of our events or meetings, to let her know immediately. We all readily agreed. Perhaps to lighten the mood, Mrs. O said we could follow her over to one of the restaurants nearby, where she'd get us food to thank us for volunteering. That did help put us at ease, and we reconvened at this burger place called Ricky's that a few of us had gone to before. Over lunch, we started to open up and share our observations about Jason, mostly joking about how weird those 2 encounters were. It also dawned on me that I hadn't seen the car he arrived in. It looked like he was walking to the other side of the parking lot, so maybe his mom was picking him up? Or he was taking the bus? None of us really knew. In the coming weeks, we had a few more meetings and volunteered at a couple more places, including this one store that helped recycle aquariums and old pet supplies, which was really fun. Each time we'd hold our breath, waiting for Jason to show up randomly, but he never did. None of us actually even saw him on campus, or off campus for that matter. Eventually Mrs. O tried to look Jason up in the school records, which apparently was a process, but when she finally got access, she couldn't find anyone matching his description. Now that was a problem, because it meant there could have possibly been an intruder on campus. There was still a chance that he was someone's sibling, or was a student at another high school who had been visiting as part of a sports event. For reference, our high school was pretty big. I think it had like 800 students, and we had a lot of different clubs and sports teams. Unfortunately, none of us, including Mrs. O, had any other information on this guy besides his first name and physical description. Likely because of the incidents with Jason, the school started becoming more strict about locking all of the outside doors and making all visitors, including students from other schools, sign in at the front office. Finally, the trip to Milwaukee rolled around, and we had managed to put Jason out of our minds for the most part. At least, all of us except maybe Lakshmi. We'd finished selling all of the boxes of candy, and our parents contributed the rest of the money for the trip. The charter bus arrived at 9:30, and after getting our stuff in Mrs. O's room, we climbed aboard. Mike and RJ broke out the snacks almost immediately, and we were all laughing. I got out my laptop and RJ started watching me play one of the old Command & Conquer games. Everything was going great. Cut forward to that afternoon when we were checking in at the hotel in the convention center. It was a Marriott and was very nice and a little crowded. Mrs. O was just handing out the keycards when I saw someone out of the corner of my eye. It took me a moment to realize who it was, or at least, who it might be. There was a kid that looked like Jason, but I couldn't be sure. He was standing near the entrance and was wearing sunglasses. I couldn't tell what, if anything, he was doing, and it didn't look like he was there with anyone. I was debating about whether or not to tell anyone what I saw, but ultimately I decided not to. I just wasn't sure enough it was him, and he'd also been gone for almost 2 months at this point. If only I knew what was going to happen. I'll skip forward to the next day. As part of the conference, clubs from each school had to give short presentations on various topics. They all vaguely had to do with professionalism or interpersonal communication or stuff like that. Mike had convinced Mrs. O to let us do kind of a skit, and though I'm not sure we were actually supposed to do that, she let us anyway. The first presentation was at 9, and we were like halfway down the list, meaning we'd go at around 10:30. The rest of the group were watching the presentations, while RJ, Locke, and I were rehearsing our parts in one of the random unoccupied meeting rooms in the conference center. We didn't actually care about the presentation that much, and we were more just goofing off. Midway through one of his lines, RJ said "dude" and pointed to the doorknob. It was moving. We immediately suspected Mike was going to surprise us, so we both fell silent and walked next to the door, trying to surprise him instead. Lakshmi started giggling and stayed where she was. Any moment we knew Mike would push the door open and start yelling, but he didn't. Instead, whoever it was stopped turning the doorknob. RJ and I looked at each other, then, figuring this was still part of Mike's plan, decided to open the door forcefully and jump out into the hallway. That's exactly what we did, but we were not at all expecting to see what we saw. Instead of Mike standing there wearing some goofy grin, we saw Jason. Not only that, but he was dressed in a suit, carrying a bouquet of flowers. While it's true some of the people at the conference were dressed in business formal, seeing Jason there holding flowers was completely out of place. I think RJ and I both suspected at the exact same time what he was up to. As if to eliminate any doubt, Jason asked us if Lakshmi was with us. In addition to acting like a complete stalker, the way he said that so nonchalantly was so strange. Like, we hadn't even seen him for 2 months, and he was just some random dude who snuck into our school. I took the lead and said, "No, she's not here," very matter-of-factly. There was no way in hell we were letting him in there with Lakshmi. Then Jason actually asked us where she was. We were getting more creeped out by the second, and we were careful to keep blocking the doorway so Locke would be out of his field of view. RJ told him that she wasn't interested and to go home, but what Jason said next caught us completely off guard. He asked RJ if he was her brother. To be clear, RJ and Locke weren't related, though since they were both Indian, I guess that's why he said that. RJ actually told Jason that no, he was not her brother, but that he needed to leave her alone, in what I thought was a calm voice. But apparently that was enough to make Jason snap. The next thing I knew, Jason dropped the flowers and pulled out a large pocket knife. We both took a step back, and RJ told him to put it down and not be stupid. Honestly, I'm not sure that was the right thing to say in that situation, and Jason lunged towards RJ. Thankfully, he easily ducked out of the way, and Jason fell forward onto the ground. We immediately got on top of him, and I wrestled the knife out of his hand. Jason wasn't screaming, but he continued to thrash around. It didn't matter though, because people were already coming over, including a security guard. He tried to get Jason to calm down, but when that didn't work, the guard put him in cuffs. Things quickly turned into a huge scene. A random teacher went into our room to check if anyone else was in there and found Lakshmi crying. Actual cops showed up, and the event organizers stopped the presentations and asked everyone to remain in place. When people were finally given the all clear, Mrs. O'Malley rushed over and threw her arms around both Lakshmi and us. Lauren and Emily were speechless, and so was Mike. We soon found out that Jason was there with other people from his high school, which was about an hour away from ours. I didn't speak to any of them firsthand, but apparently they were shocked at what happened, and had no idea that one of their students was stalking one of ours. As far as the conference, some of the events got cancelled or pushed back, but it did continue. Mrs. O'Malley contacted each of our parents and explained the situation. Since Jason had been taken into custody, all of them were okay with us staying, all except Lakshmi's parents. Quite understandably, they drove up to get her. When her parents arrived, we all walked over and met them in the lobby. It was an emotional scene, and they actually thanked me and RJ quite a bit. I didn't have the heart to tell anybody that I had probably seen Jason the day before, so I kept that to myself. After we saw them to the door, we all went back to our respective hotel rooms for the night. Nothing eventful happened during the rest of the conference, and we went back home on Sunday as planned. As expected, there was a big investigation when we got back, but RJ and I didn't find out more of the backstory from it. However, our senior year we ran into someone from Jason's school who filled us in on what they knew. I won't share all the personal details, but Jason had some serious issues, and he got expelled after what happened at the conference. Apparently no one at their high school knew anything about Jason stalking someone at another school, and the guy who we talked to was shocked to hear that Jason actually snuck into our club one day. Our best guess was that he met Lakshmi in passing, or maybe even just saw her at another school event, but none of us were sure. Locke never really opened up too much about what happened, and we never pressed her for more details. Thinking back, it all seems so bizarre. But I'm just thankful that RJ and I were practicing our presentation with Lakshmi, because who knows what that wacko would have done if we weren't there.